Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Mroz Institute Global World Affairs Colloquium Series. My name is Max Kovalov, and I am the director of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute. Thank you for being with us tonight. The mission of the Mroz Global Leadership Institute is to promote essential skills of global fluency and educate new generations about diplomacy. We work to prepare students to become future global leaders through a variety of professional development programs. I encourage you to visit our website at mrozinstitute.cfc.edu to learn about our programs. The Colloquium Series is one of the programs run by the Mroz Global Leadership Institute, and this program is designed to bring to campus prominent speakers with international experience for important conversations or for conversations on important topics, so that they could stimulate discussions with our students, faculty members, and members of the community. Thank you for joining us tonight. I want to thank our partners, the World Affairs Council of Charleston. This event is hosted as co-sponsored by the World Affairs Council of Charleston and the Mroz Global Leadership Institute. I now want to turn the program to one of the global ambassadors, Joseph Drobina, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Professor. It is my pleasure to introduce Ambassador Ross. Ambassador Dennis Ross is counselor and distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior to returning to the Institute in 2011, he served 2 years as special assistant to President Obama and National Security Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as a special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East, peace process, and dealing directly with the parties in negotiations. A highly skilled diplomat, Ambassador Ross was U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israeli-Jordan peace treaty, and intensely worked to bring Israel and Syria together.
Thank you, Joseph, for this introduction, and thank you to our remote audience and in-person audience. Thank you for being with us tonight. I will start with a couple of questions for Ambassador Ross, and then we will open the floor to questions and answers from the live audience and from the webinar audience. Our webinar audience, please use the chat or the Q&A feature in your webinar to ask questions, and we will read your questions here. One of the global ambassadors will read your questions. Ambassador Ross, thank you for joining us here tonight, and welcome to the College of Charleston.
Thanks for having me. Look forward.
You served as a diplomat for multiple administrations. You served for Republican and Democratic administrations. Peace negotiations in the Middle East have been on the agenda of every administration. How do you assess the overall effectiveness of the U.S. over the last decades? I know it's a big question, but how do you assess the effectiveness of the U.S. as a mediator of the peace process in the Middle East?
Well, if you just look at the results, you'd have to say something is left to be desired, right? Yeah, but I think you really have to take a step back. When I say that, it's not as if the U.S. is a party to these conflicts. We're not at war with them. They're at war with each other. And a mediator succeeds when the mediator is put in a position where the parties themselves really want to produce an outcome. A mediator doesn't impose an outcome. A mediator does have the ability to create incentives and to impose consequences. At the end of the day, at least between Israelis and the Palestinians, if the two are not really ready to make peace with each other, you're not really going to be able to produce it for them. So, you measure mediation not solely in terms of whether or not you achieve a peaceful outcome. You measure it in terms of what have you prevented? What have you limited? What have you done to change the overall environment so that what isn't possible now can become possible over time? The criteria for mediation and then the way to evaluate mediation One thing I'm sure is it's not for us. Okay. The, you know, the result should be measured by not just have you suddenly produced peace. By the way, even if you do, you know, there's still the question, is it sustainable? But it should also be, you should be thinking in terms of what have you done to change the situation so that it moves towards the better. A lot of conflicts aren't ready to resolve. I often talk about, you know, mediation. Like when I think about Russia and Ukraine, as an example, nobody's going to go in there right now and produce a mediation that succeeds, because Putin can't lose in his mind, and Zelensky at this point still needs to win. A mediation can begin when two sides are looking for a way out. And by the way, not necessarily they're looking for a way to resolve it or even end it, but they decide the nature of the conflict is such that the cost of its continuing is too high. The cost may be high between Russia and Ukraine, but it isn't at the point where either decides that too high, we have to find a way out. And so it's the absence of this kind of, at least a negative commonality. A negative commonality is when two sides say, okay, you know, this conflict is too high. That may produce a situation where each side is open to negotiating about lessening the nature of the conflict, not necessarily ending the conflict. So that's on the, you know, that's what you do to think through, you know, whether you go into a mediation and what you can achieve with a mediation. Results of mediations, you know, depend on, again, what your objective for it is. A lot of times you have to ask the question, why do we do a mediation? Do we do a mediation because we think we're going to resolve the conflict? Or do we do a mediation because it shows we're a good global citizen? You know, meaning there may be other reasons or objectives that you have in mind when you do a mediation. So what I'm giving you is a long-winded way of avoiding saying, gee, we haven't done so well.
With the US's recent pivot to China, this chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the conflict, the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine that you mentioned, it almost has, we almost have this perception that the US has been withdrawing from the Middle East. Is this perception accurate?
You know, the perception is not accurate. If you actually want to take a look at the actual presence of American forces in the Middle East, the numbers actually haven't declined very much at all. You know, we still have between 35 and 40,000 forces overall throughout the region. We dwarf anybody else in terms of our numbers. The problem is not the presence. The problem is the perception of what we're prepared to do with the presence. The perception is that we aren't prepared to use our forces to produce changes on the ground. When the Russians intervened in Syria, they intervened with a very small presence. In fact, they never had more than 2,000 forces. They never had more than 24 aircraft. The capabilities paled in comparison to what we had. But they went in with the express purpose of saving the Assad regime. And they were able to save the Assad regime. So that created an impression, at least at the time, that Russian power could make a difference. Now we now know that it created an impression of Russian strength that actually doesn't exist. They have a very hollow military. We don't have a hollow military. But we are also stung by the fact that we involved ourselves in two very long wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, with results that are hard to identify in terms of anything that's positive, with high costs in both places, and with less credibility in the eyes of the American public about the role of the use of force, and without explaining that if you're going to use force, the choices aren't, gee, we don't intervene at all, or we put more than 100,000 troops on the ground. There's a lot of intervening steps. There's a lot of different kinds of options that can be employed. And had we done that, had we thought in those terms, our ability to use coercion effectively would exist today. It exists much less today because there's a perception here at home we don't want to intervene for reasons that are understandable given what those interventions look like. When I heard, I have a lot of friends in the Biden administration. Known many of them for a long time, worked with many of them. When I heard the term relentless diplomacy used, I'm sort of smiling because what does relentless diplomacy mean? We're going to talk you to death. That'll do it. Relentless diplomacy was supposed to be an antidote to what the Trump administration represented, where there was seen as a diminution of interest in using diplomacy. The issue is, how do you use diplomacy effectively? I can tell you, as someone who has done a lot of mediation and negotiations, if you don't have a coercive element backing your negotiations, your prospects of success, whatever you define the objective to be, are very limited. Now, by the way, when I say coercion and I use leverage, coercion has by definition a negative connotation. That implies you put pressure on. It implies you make threats. Leverage can be negative and positive. Leverage can be you can offer inducements because you have the capability. So leverage comes in different forms. We haven't always used our leverage effectively. And you could say that, we didn't, when the Saudis increased, when the Saudis made this decision on OPEC Plus to reduce their production of oil, you could say we didn't exercise our leverage very effectively.
I do want to come back to this question about the OPEC Plus, but before I get there, you mentioned the Biden administration policy. What is your assessment of the Biden administration Middle East policy right now?
It's part of the problem with I think the administration's policy in the Middle East is that it hasn't really been a priority. And that's fair enough. You don't have to make it a priority, but when you send a signal that it's not a priority, it's going to affect your leverage and the readiness of others to respond to you. So when President Biden came in, he called no Middle Eastern leader for 5 weeks. He called leaders from all over the world in advance. This was a very conscious signal that he was sending, that we're not interested in being involved in, what are the troubles of the region. We're downplaying it. We have an interest in competing with China. We're going to focus on that. We have an interest in ensuring that our foreign policy serves the interests of the American worker. We're going to build back better, both domestically and foreign policy. Build back better foreign policy meant restore our alliances. And it had a place in Europe. It had a place for competition with the Chinese, but the Middle East was really put to the side. I've often said, and it goes back, I'll tell you, during the transition from Reagan to Bush, I've had a major role in terms of briefing and then working for Jim Baker. And I was responsible for organizing and doing a number of the briefings on a different set of issues, including then the Soviet Union, but also the Middle East broadly defined. And Baker says to me as we're sitting down to talk about the Middle East, he says, I'm not going to fly around the Middle East the way George Shultz did, which of course he ended up flying around the Middle East dramatically more than George Shultz did. And he said, the Middle East is where secretaries of state go to die. That I want to be a successful Secretary of State. I don't want to be involved with failed initiatives. Fair enough. Failure is not usually a prescription for success. But I said to him at the time, I said, fine, you can say you want to stay away from the Middle East, but one thing I can promise you, the Middle East will not stay away from you. And the problem is you want to be shaping responses to you. You don't want to be responding to what's happening there. And I think what happened, the Biden administration came in reluctant to be involved, and ultimately its hand was forced. Now, Iran also forced its hand because Iran decided, okay, we'll force ourselves onto the agenda. We'll force ourselves onto the agenda by accelerating our approach on our nuclear program. So they'll have to be responsive to us. So look, overall, do I think that they have managed a number of things? Well, yeah, I think they've done okay. I think at this point, what's left to be desired are sort of 3 things. One, the approach to Iran is still, I would say, it's not clear. What is the strategy for dealing with Iran today? Is it a containment strategy? Is it an effort to use our partners, to work with our partners to limit what the Iranians can do? What is the strategy when it comes to the nuclear issue? Simply to reestablish the JCPOA, and what happens if we can't reestablish the JCPOA? There isn't really a clear explanation of what the policy is on those issues. There is, and there has been a very interesting achievement just yesterday. The Amos Hochstein of the Biden administration brokered an agreement on a maritime boundary between Israel and Lebanon. They will not sign agreements with each other because Lebanon is not prepared to give up the state of war with Israel, nor to recognize it, but they'll meet in Nakura on the border and they'll each sign separately with us. It still is a very good agreement, even if it doesn't end the state of war. It reduces dramatically the risk of a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel is going to begin extracting from what's known as the Karish rig, and Hezbollah had threatened that if they did that, and there wasn't sufficient understanding of the maritime boundary, so that Lebanon could begin to have Total begin to explore what it could extract on its side, that they wouldn't let Israel begin to drill and produce from the rig. And Israel is very clear. You try to stop us, we'll act militarily, and you won't stop us, and we'll inflict great pain on you. So, I gave an example of one objective of mediation may not always be a peace treaty, but it may be, if you're averting a war or conflict, that's a good thing. That was done. Secondly, by doing this, it's building a Lebanese state in preserving stability, because this is a state that is a failed state right now. It is in desperate need of generating revenue. Being able to exploit this field will generate revenue. They have no interest in putting at risk their ability to do that. Hezbollah signaled that it has no interest in frustrating that because of the situation there. Hezbollah wouldn't normally go along with an agreement with Israel, but they did here. And the administration was smart enough to realize that with mediation, we could do this. So this is an example of something that was done quite well. The problem, I still say, in answer to your question, is what's the overall approach to the region? And there is enough of a doubt in the minds of the Saudis and others that they don't see a price in not being responsive to us. If they saw an overall approach and they understood how they fit into it and how we would help to ensure their security, or at least protect them, the cost to them of saying no to us and something that mattered to us would have been much higher than it was. They felt they could say no and at no real cost. They define it, they see this as being part of preserving stability in the oil market, stability of price in the oil market, because they see a recession coming and they say we're overproducing, so let's reduce our output in advance of the recession. Now, if reducing the output drives up the price of oil for now, increases inflation for now, it will deepen, ironically, the recessionary pressures, which ironically also will end up dampening demand to the point where the price of oil will drop precipitously. Their argument was, this is the way we can manage it. I'm not so sure it's an argument that's compelling. In any case, if they felt that they had a lot to lose with the administration, they wouldn't have done it, but they did.
And this is an interesting comment that you're making about the Saudis. It almost seems like there's not enough. They're not feeling that they can say no. And I want to ask you about this OPEC Plus decision to cut production and it seems like it's an economic decision, as you were explaining that. Yeah. Keep the price up a little bit, but then there could be a backlash to this. Right. So on the one hand, it is an economic decision, but at the same time, it almost seems like it's a political backlash to the Biden administration policy and to his reluctance to engage with MBS during the first year of his administration. And Fareed Zakaria even called this decision by the OPEC to increase production or to cut production as a defeat for the White House. How do you assess this OPEC decision? Is it a pure economic decision driven by pure economic concerns, or is it really a kind of a sign, a political cost to the Biden administration and a sign to show that, hey, we are not playing by your rules?
How about all of the above? Look, there is clearly in the Saudi mind an economic argument here. Their position is, if you look over time at the circumstances, the economic circumstances, and they will say, we looked at the past, we saw conditions very similar to today, and we saw that when we didn't reduce output at that point, it ended up producing a much greater decline later on. And so it was smarter not to wait for that. It was smarter to begin to reduce output now. I would say, strictly in economic terms, they might even be right. I'm not sure, but they might even be right. But they also had to know this, what they view as strictly an economic decision, was not going to be perceived as strictly an economic decision. You make this decision 1 month before the midterm elections here. You make this decision in the aftermath of President Biden having gone to Saudi Arabia, overriding his own hesitancy to do it, and obviously a lot of political criticism from his own political party for doing it. And you do this in response, it makes it look like you are sticking your thumb in his eye. So for them to be completely unaware of that kind of stretches the bounds of credulity. That's why I was saying earlier, they did it. It's like they're sending a message. Part of the message goes back to what you said. There wasn't, and certainly in MBS's eyes, a kind of humiliating approach by the administration towards him. And that built a sense that, okay, he came, but we really don't owe him anything. That's number one. Number two, they're very unhappy with how we're approaching Iran, partly because they don't see us doing a lot to counter what the Iranians are doing in the region, and because the administration continues to make it clear it will go back to the JCPOA if the Iranians are willing to go back. It makes the Iranians the arbiter of whether or not there's an agreement. And there isn't a clear explanation of what happens if there isn't an agreement. So from the Saudi perspective, they look at the agreement very negatively, mostly because they say it will provide a huge infusion of resources for Iran. And it has no effect on their troublemaking capacity. It has no effect on their ballistic missile program. It will be seized upon by them to strengthen themselves throughout the region and to give, Hezbollah, they'll give a lot more resources. The Houthis, they'll give a lot more resources. They'll feed the Shia militias, the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq. From the Saudi perspective, these are all real threats. And so they're saying, look, you're not responding to things that matter to us. And yet you want us to be responding to you on something that we see will actually cost us something. They believe, and I don't think this is artificial, they believe it will cost them something. In the past, if they felt the relationship was important enough to protect because of what they felt they got from it, they probably wouldn't have made this decision. I had a friend of mine say that Jim Baker, who I work for, if he were Secretary of State, they never would have done this. Now, for two reasons. One, because they trusted if he made a certain commitment and talked about security, we'd live up to it. Two, they also knew that a hammer would come down on them if they did it. We're seeing, the president says we're reevaluating the relationship. Okay, what does that really mean we're going to do? And I'm not arguing that the hammer should come down. I'm arguing that what we should be doing is we should probably be bringing a senior, maybe what I maybe the defense minister from Saudi Arabia here, who is the brother of the crown prince, and talking about, all right, let's define some boundaries right now. You can see if Biden had said nothing, you saw that you had the chairman, the Democratic chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Menendez, who is a centrist. You see that he came down and said, I won't support any arms sale to Saudi Arabia. It's a huge statement. You know, I believe we're going to see the Houthis launching cruise missiles and drones again into Saudi Arabia. And what, we're not going to provide any means of defense for that? You know, this is an indication that what the Saudis did has, you know, struck a nerve here. And it means that we ought to figure out, you know, we don't have a relationship with Saudi Arabia as a favor to the Saudis. We have a relationship with Saudi Arabia because it happens to be in our interests. And if oil facilities in Saudi Arabia are being threatened, you think that's not going to affect the price of oil? Of course it's going to. So we will be ready to act to defend that. So the point is, we have interests. We got to figure out how we can begin to make sure this doesn't spin out of control, but at the same time, make it clear to the Saudis, look, we're prepared to take the following steps. This is what we require from you. I mean, I've made a suggestion, which so far hasn't been acted on, to both sides. I said the Saudis should do what they've often done before. We've had many, many OPEC agreements that they have chosen to observe in the breach. Okay, you got an agreement. They decide, okay, we're not going to implement the cuts. We could say, okay, don't implement cuts. Let's work on a set of things that matter to you. That's what we could be doing. So I think we should be doing.
Thank you. At this point, I have a couple of more questions that I would really like to ask a question about the relationship between Israel and Ukraine and the nuclear deal. But I really want to open at this point this floor for the Q&A session. If anyone has a question for our speaker, there is a microphone in the middle of the aisle. Will you please come up to the microphone and use the microphone? And for our remote audience, please use the Q&A section to ask your question.
I'm glad you brought up Iran and Saudi Arabia. When Obama decided to do this agreement, horrifying, absolutely horrendous agreement with Iran, the biggest supporter of terror, suddenly Saudi Arabia was open to talks with Israel. During the previous administration, there were 4 peace treaties between 4 Arab countries that are very successful with Israel right now. And I think that I would like to ask you what your opinion is, because I have a very strong opinion. When the Palestinians don't want peace, but when you expect them to have peace with Israel and they are refusing, and in 2005, they were supposed to acknowledge the existence of Israel as a Jewish state based on the roadmap to peace. On the one hand, you're wanting to have peace between Israel and the Palestinians. And on the other hand, you're having agreements with Iran that is supporting both Hezbollah, that, by the way, is not happy with the agreement for the oil or the gas in Israel. Lebanon is, but Hezbollah already threatened that they're not happy with that. And then on the other hand, you have Hamas and Hezbollah getting money from Iran to do terror against Israel. So isn't that kind of a contradiction of, yeah, we want to help to have peace between Israel and the Palestinians. We want to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia because they're going to give us oil that right now we're not going to have oil over here. And as an environmentalist, I think that bringing the oil from there to here is more damaging to the environment than actually drilling over here, but that's another topic. But basically this Iran deal is creating a lot of issues with both Saudi Arabia and Israel and the Palestinians. So what good is this deal with Iran that they're going to have nuclear head by 2025, from my understanding?
No, but okay. I mean,
according to many experts.
Well, let me put it this way. You covered a lot there.
Yep.
And I'm going to try to parse it and get to the essence of what I think you're really asking. I think what you're really asking is, any deal with Iran by definition is one that would be unlikely to be fulfilled in the end and wouldn't prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon, number one. Number two, sorry? They're very close to having weapons grade enrichment capability. I mean, I know the details of this and I can go through this in minute detail if you want. Now, I'm going to try to answer your question, okay? So number one, there is this, pursuing a deal with the Iranians doesn't make a lot of sense, okay? From your standpoint. And I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of the JCPOA, okay? Partly because I think it defers the issue of Iran having a nuclear weapon. It doesn't end the issue of Iran having a nuclear weapon. But then you brought in the Israelis and the Palestinians, say the Palestinians don't want peace. They continue to reject Israel as a Jewish state, which precedes the roadmap to peace and follows the roadmap to peace and so forth. And so the implication was, why pursue any arrangement between the Israelis and the Palestinians? Well, I couldn't hear you.
Trying to have a peace treaty with the Palestinians while trying to have an agreement with Iran that funds a lot of the terror against Israel by the Palestinians.
Okay.
Also by
Okay, no, that's a fair point, that part of the issue with the Iranians is the Iranians want to dominate the region. They view the United States and Israel as the main impediments to them dominating the region. They define Israel as, the little Satan as opposed to the United States, which is the big Satan. And they will oppose any peace agreement between the Israelis and Palestinians and try to subvert it. That's all true, okay? The question is, what's the best way to counter the Iranians on the one hand, build our relationship with Sunni Arabs on the other, and where does Israel fit in that? And the Abraham Accords is a good thing. I gave a talk last night in which I explained the Abraham Accords reflected a change in the region. The initiative for the Abraham Accords came from the UAE, not from the Trump administration. The UAE came to the Trump administration and Jared Kushner was smart enough to take advantage of it. And it's a very good thing. But what it reflected was that Arab states, certainly Sunni Arab states, are increasingly less willing or able to wait for Palestinian leaders who they think will never agree to an outcome with the Israelis. They're not prepared to deny themselves what is in their interest by what they get from Israel. What I was saying is there is a way to relate what you do with Arab states and the Palestinians, meaning if you look at what the Emirates said, they said, we will fully normalize with Israel, but the price is Israel cannot annex the territories allotted to it under the Trump peace plan. That was the choice they made. The Trump administration made a commitment to them that there would be no Israeli annexation of the territory for at least 4 years. So what the Emirates did was create a linkage, but a reverse linkage. Historically, there was a linkage that said there can be no normalization with Israel so long as there's occupation. And what the Emirates said is, we'll normalize with Israel, but they can't annex territory. What they were doing, in effect, was saying, we'll normalize with Israel, and we want the Israelis not to take a negative step towards the Palestinians. Okay, so they created an interesting linkage. They reversed the historical pattern. They said, okay, we're going to do something that works for us and can be helpful to the Palestinians. But we're not going to wait, because if we wait, we're going to lose and we're going to deny what is important to us, and nothing will change with the Israelis and the Palestinians anyway. Okay, so I guess what I would say to your question, I don't have a problem pursuing diplomacy with the Iranians. My problem is that we pursue it in a way that doesn't take account of the fact that they've lost their fear of us. And unless we restore their fear of us, they have no incentive to change their behavior on the nuclear issue. If they thought that they could lose the entire nuclear infrastructure they have invested the last 40 years in, hundreds of billions of dollars in, their attitude towards a negotiation would change. So I would like to do that. Now, if we adopted that kind of a posture that you use, as I was saying before, a coercive backdrop to the diplomacy, that would also impress the Saudis. It would impress the Emiratis. They would feel that they could count more on us. It would also reassure the Israelis.
I'm sorry, I want to, as a moderator, I would like to give an opportunity to ask questions for other members of the audience. Thank you, Ambassador.
Sure.
Question from one of the global ambassadors, and then do you mind coming to the microphone?
You were
My
cutting
question?
in and out as you were talking, so it's hard to pick up what you said.
Okay, sorry. My name is Claire Turner, and going back to your career, I think that there's a big assumption that in order to get into defense, both with negotiations and peace treaties, that you have to have a military background. So I was wondering if you could touch on how you got interested into negotiations and peace treaties, both as an interest and then as your career.
Okay. I was as a student, I was always interested in international relations. As a student, Vietnam was the war at the time that I felt rather passionately about. I was not a pacifist, but I thought this was a war that basically made us less capable of intervening in places that were more important to us. And I resolved over time that I wanted to affect policy. I was not someone who was focused on negotiations per se. I kind of got drafted into that. And I had been interested in conflict resolution. But when I went into the government initially, it was in the Defense Department. And a lot of what I did focused very heavily on looking at balance of military forces, how you project military force, where force could be used and how it could be used, what were the constraints on its use. The more I got into that, the more I saw the relationship between that and diplomacy. So it was, it wasn't something where I was riveted on, gee, I want to go in, I want to do negotiations, I want to think about how coercive diplomacy works. That wasn't it at all. I just gradually assumed different sets of responsibilities, and as I assumed those responsibilities, I became more and more focused on these kinds of issues. When one says that we should always try to resolve things diplomatically, of course, it's a truism. When one says that war is a last resort, it's a truism. But those are slogans. That's not policy. Policy is what you actually do. Now, slogans sometimes have a value in terms of explaining your policy so it can be supported domestically. If you can't support a policy domestically, you can't sustain it. So there is a value for slogans, at least in terms of being able to sell policies. I still think we're better off explaining what we're doing as opposed to using slogans as a kind of shorthand to try to explain it. That's why I made the point earlier. When you talk about the use of force, we've fallen into this pattern that, it's either 100,000 troops or 200,000 troops on the ground, or it's nothing. And that ends up inviting the very thing you don't want. With Iran as an example, there are a series of things I propose that we could do to convince the Iranians that they're running a risk that they believe that today they don't believe they're running. They don't believe we will ever act against them militarily. And so long as they believe that, they are much more willing to run risks They're much more willing to pursue their nuclear program because they think ultimately they can get it and will do nothing about it. And at some point, they will miscalculate. Because the irony is, when we say we won't let them have a nuclear weapon, I think we mean it. I think actually Biden means it, but they don't believe it. So the potential for miscalculation goes up when they don't believe that we'll actually use force. If you don't want to have to use force, you have to convince the side that you're trying to convince that you will. If you don't, you actually make the use of force more likely. So diplomacy is the mechanism you use, and you use different tools to be persuasive. Yes, you can squeeze economically. Yes, you have all sorts of covert options where you can do things that, again, limit what they have, what they can do. The point is, use all your tools in a way that becomes convincing. One of the tools you have, it comes back to public diplomacy. If we were seen as saying publicly, we want diplomacy to resolve the Iranian nuclear program, but the Iranians right now appear to be using diplomacy as a cover to achieve a nuclear weapon. We will not allow them to do that. And so the Iranians need to understand, and we want the world to understand, that if they continue down this road, there will come a point where they will put their entire nuclear infrastructure at risk. If we were to begin to say that publicly, the Iranians would understand we're getting the world used to the idea that we might use force. That sends them a signal. So you want to send signals, it's not only with forces, it's also how you change your public posture, and then how you reinforce it, or the exercises, the military exercises you run. That sends a signal, here are the words and here are some of the actions we're taking to show we're preparing our capability to act if you aren't responsive. The idea that Iran gets a nuclear weapon, if they get a nuclear weapon, it means the Middle East will become a nuclear armed region. Because the Saudis have already said, if they get a nuclear weapon, we'll get one. Egypt will then get one. Turkey will get one. None of the rules that applied during the Cold War will apply here. Because we had what was known as mutually assured destruction, or the balance of terror. We both had secure second strike capabilities, meaning we couldn't be disarmed by a first strike. None of the countries that will get these weapons will have a secure second strike capability. All of them will have forces that are highly vulnerable. So in a crisis, the impulse to strike first will be very high. This is not an outcome we want to see.
I want to take as many questions as possible. Do we have, maybe we can have two students ask questions, and then, so go ahead, come up to the microphone. So go ahead. And the same side, gentleman.
Wait, sorry.
Go ahead.
All right. My first question. Well, I just have like two questions. What will be the American interests in Southwest Asia after oil eventually dries up? And did U.S. intervention in Southwest Asia in the 90s indirectly cause 9/11?
Say the latter one again, say it again.
Did U.S. intervention in Southwest Asia in the 1990s indirectly cause 9/11?
Oh, all right. Okay. You want me to take that, or you want to take that?
One more question. Yeah, go ahead.
No, it's from someone else.
Behind you. Yeah, someone else. Yeah, please.
Good afternoon, Ambassador. How do you feel about the historic perspective that the Zionist state of Israel, although is a nationalist movement, takes many forms of a colonial movement? And to what responsibility do Western powers that supported the movement have in the rising tensions that have occurred since?
Okay. All right, so let me deal with the first set of questions first, and then I'll deal with yours. If oil runs out, will we have an interest in Southwest Asia? First of all, oil isn't going to run out as something that we all depend on for at least 20 to 25 years. So between now and then, if you want to have a transition to renewables and you don't want to have us constantly being victimized by a gyration in oil prices, you're going to have a strategy for how you manage oil between now and then. If we were really smart, what we'd be doing is we'd be going to the oil companies and we'd be saying to them the following: we're going to work with you on regulations so you can produce more, but the condition is you have to invest in carbon capture, you have to invest in green hydrogen, you have to become a partner in the process of renewal. So we should be doing. We're not doing that right now. So that will allow us to manage the transition away from fossil fuels from where we are. Will we have an interest in Southwest Asia when oil is less important? Much less than the one we have today. Because, look at where we are. Suddenly we have this reaction to the Saudis deciding they're going to produce less oil because it has an economic impact, not just here, but internationally. So at least as long as that's the case, we'll have an interest. Now it doesn't mean we have no interest. Okay? Doesn't mean we have no interest even after oil. I often describe the Middle East as a place where the Las Vegas rules don't apply, meaning what takes place there doesn't stay there. So you still have terrorism that will come from there. You still have an interest in producing a kind of stability and modernization and development that helps to build effective, modern, resilient economies and societies so that the growth of terrorism doesn't emerge. That's still going to exist. But the nature of the scale of our interest will be different than it is when we really are past the era of fossil fuels. But that's more than a quarter of a century away. All right. The second question, did our actions in Southwest Asia produce 9/11? My answer to that is no. The premise of the question, and you may be just repeating what others have said, the premise of the question is somehow our presence over there is what produced a reaction. I'm not saying we didn't have, especially in Iraq, that we didn't produce certain reactions, but you have to look, those who carried out 9/11, they have an ideology that hates our existence. You go back and you read Sayyid Qutb. He spent a couple of years here. He was in many ways the kind of ideological forerunner of, and Al-Qaeda Osama bin Laden drew a lot of inspiration from his writings. He actually was hanged by Nasser in Egypt in 1966. He portrayed a world in which our very existence was a corruption and a threat to Islam. And so those who carried out 9/11 looked at us as being a threat to their very existence. And even if we hadn't been in Iraq, they would still have looked as a threat to our existence. There may be their ability to recruit related to some of our actions, but the existence of the ideology predated that. This is a guy who was, Sayyid Qutb came to the United States in the 1940s. You look at the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is an ideology of complete intolerance of the other. So my answer is no, it didn't produce 9/11. What produced 9/11 was Al-Qaeda. In answer to your question, Zionism was the national liberation movement of the Jewish people, right? So what it represents is a belief that the Jewish people as a people were a nation, had historic attachments to the land, and had a right to a state. And what we see today, there are those who look at what Israel does in the West Bank. They got out of Gaza, right? Israel had a presence of almost 9,000 settlers in Gaza, and they withdrew all the settlements. I can tell you, I went into Gaza and gave a speech to what was then the Palestinian Council of Foreign Relations in Gaza. It was before the withdrawal, but after Sharon had already announced he was going to withdraw. And I went and I said, you know, the Palestinians have never been the masters of their own fate. In 48, the Arabs were going to take care of their interests. They were going to take care of Israel. They're going to take care of the Arabs of Palestine's interests. And of course, they failed in that. Yasser Arafat, when we were at Camp David, said to me that he wanted to go to the original Camp David, but the Soviets and the Syrians told him not to go. I was to tell him in that summit, I said, look, in the past, you know, you didn't control your destiny, now you do. You can say yes here, and you will produce a Palestinian state. You will be fulfilling and controlling your own destiny by doing that. He chose not to do it. In 2005, when I was speaking to this audience of actually close to 300 Palestinians, one of the things I said was, okay, the Israelis are getting out. Now, when they get out, they give you a major opportunity. And the opportunity you have is to turn Gaza into something. Build it. Make it successful. You know, if you do that, within Israel itself, there'll be Israelis who say, look, if it works in Gaza, then why not the West Bank? There's no great, there are a minority in Israel favors occupation. I mean, they won't call it occupation, but a minority in Israel wants to control Palestinians. Most don't. But they view it as a security issue as well. So I said, if you prove that you're going to turn Gaza into a going concern, you'll find that Israelis will say, fine, we can do this in the West Bank as well. But if you turn Gaza into a platform for attacks against Israel, who in Israel is going to say, gee, we can afford to get out of the West Bank? The answer is nobody. And what in fact happened was precisely what I was warning against. You know, and I can tell you, even as the Israelis were withdrawing, Hamas was responsible for attacking the crossing points. There were 6 crossing points between Israel and Gaza, where everything basically went through. I mean, all kinds of goods, people, and so forth. While Israel was withdrawing, Hamas attacked, you know, 2 of the crossing points. Who was that hurting? The Israelis or themselves? In the end, Hamas took over in Gaza after the Israelis withdrew, and they basically turned it into what is what looks like a disaster for Palestinians who live there. They didn't seek to develop Gaza. What they have sought is to develop their resistance ideology and the weapons to pursue that. So you have an Israeli presence in the West Bank, and it continues to grow. I will tell you, I'd like to see it stop in terms of growing, because I believe in a 2 states for 2 peoples outcome. I believe in that because I think it's the only stable outcome. There are 2 national identities competing for the same space, 2 national movements. They're each legitimate national movements. I once had a senior member of Fatah say to me, he had come around to 2 states for one reason. He said, look, in one state, either they will control us or we will strive to control them. There'll be no peace in one state. So I want to preserve the possibility of 2 states. I would like to see the Israelis stop building to the east of the security barrier. The Israelis built, it was actually Yitzhak Rabin's idea. In 1995, he told me in a meeting, he said, look, I'm going to authorize the building of a separation fence. He said, I don't know if we can reach an agreement with the Palestinians, a peace agreement that produces an outcome. But I know we have to partition the land, because if we don't partition the land, we'll lose who we are. Demographically, we will lose who we are. If we're going to be a Jewish democratic state, we have to be a majority in that state. If we keep all the West Bank, we lose we won't be the majority. We'll change, we'll lose our character. Sharon, Ariel Sharon was against it at the time, and he's the one who ended up building the barrier because of the Second Intifada. It exists on about 8% of the territory closest to the Green Line, which is June 467. Before we went to Camp David in the summer of 2000, I came up with an idea, which was we'll have settlement blocks and swaps. We're going to move the border to accommodate an Israeli presence, and strategically, given the land, we'll move the border, I said at the time, 5 or 6%, and we'll absorb these blocks, and then we'll compensate the Palestinians with territory to make up for it. Settlement blocks and swaps. The barrier is built on 8% of the territory closest to the Green Line. If Israel doesn't build on the 92% that's to the east of the barrier, you have the basis of a Palestinian state, you have the basis of separation. A state today is not possible. If we had a Palestinian state tomorrow, it would be a failed state. We don't need one more failed state in the Middle East. Palestinians that I continue to work closely with, they focus on the fact that they need to have internal reform. 80% of the Palestinians in the West Bank, I'm not talking about Gaza where Hamas is in control, 80% of the Palestinians in the West Bank believe that the Palestinian Authority is completely corrupt. There needs to be thoroughgoing reform among Palestinians. They have to restructure themselves. There will come a point, if they do, where a state is possible. Politically, today you couldn't produce an outcome for two reasons. First, there's a complete division between Palestinians, between the West Bank and Gaza, not just physically, but ideologically between Hamas and Fatah. They couldn't agree on whether or not you'd even have a state or reach an agreement with Israel. So there needs to be reform. There needs to be a kind of a different consensus that emerges among Palestinians. And if that happens, my guess is you'll see politics change in Israel. But the politics in Israel have moved. 62% of Israelis identify as being right-wing today, 62%. Some of that is the outgrowth of the Second Intifada. The Second Intifada emerged after Camp David and the Clinton parameters, where you had the most forthcoming government in Israel's history, prepared to accept that. Not only was it rejected, but the answer was violence for nearly 4 years. You had 1,100 Israelis die. You had close to 4,000 Palestinians die. That left a terrible scar within Israel. It killed a peace camp in Israel, and it produced more of a rightward turn. So the political realities among Palestinians and Israelis today make it impossible to produce an outcome. That doesn't mean we should do nothing, because if you do nothing, you'll continue to have a drift. But the focus needs to be on reform among Palestinians, improving the conditions on the ground for Palestinians, increasing Arab outreach to Israel, which gives Israel a higher degree of confidence about its place in the region, using that outreach to Israel to get certain moves taken towards the Palestinians. All of this can allow you to begin to change the realities between Israelis and Palestinians. If we focus on demonizing one side or the other, I can guarantee there'll be no outcome. You know, in the end, doesn't mean everybody's equally responsible for where we are, but demonizing is not an answer to trying to resolve the conflict. So the conflict isn't going to go away. And there's a level clearly of frustration on the Palestinian side directed both against the Palestinian Authority and against their current conditions. You know, the level of violence is going up on a very regular basis. We're seeing it. We had an 18-year-old Israeli woman soldier at a checkpoint shot at point blank range the other day. We have the Israeli military going into, especially the northern part of the West Bank, Jenin and Nablus, almost every night. Why are they doing it? The Palestinian Authority is not doing it. And in many cases, these are ticking bombs. So if they don't go, you're going to have dead Israelis. But every time they go, they weaken the Palestinian Authority. So yeah, the current reality is a bad reality. And it's not simple to change it, but I think we have to try to change it.
We're out of time at 6 o'clock, but I do want to take at least one question from our online audience. Adeline, do you mind reading a question?
All right, so the first question from online, given the Mroz Institute's focus on leadership, who do you see as the potential Palestinian leader's replacement of Abu Mazen? Could you provide your views on what lies ahead for Syria?
What lies ahead for Syria is the second question. That's an easy one.
You only have a couple of minutes for this. Well, obviously, it's manageable.
Yeah, no problem. Look, on the issue of succession to Abu Mazen, he's 87 years old. There is one of the reasons you have the conditions you have right now is that there's a lot of positioning for his succession. And the problem with succession periods is everybody emphasizes their purity. They don't look to be moderate. So you're competing for succession. You see, you want to show you're more pure than anybody else. I could give you a series of names and honestly, I'm not sure any of them will actually succeed. I mean, first of all, there may be a sequence. We may go through a series of leadership, but I think we'll probably have a collective leadership. Mahmoud Abbas Abu Mazen wears 3 hats. He is the president of the Palestinian Authority. He is the head of the PLO. And he is the head of Fatah. My suspicion is 3 different people will be given those 3 different hats, and you'll have a collective leadership. Collective leaderships, almost by definition, are never stable. So how long it lasts, whether we'll see the next generation emerge. I mean, a lot of the frustration is within Fatah and within the PLO, there's no upward mobility. You have you almost have a stasis there. And you're going to end up seeing at a certain point younger Palestinians right now, they represent the full range of views, but many of them are focused on the need for, if we don't get our own house in order, we're not going to have a house at all. There are increasing numbers of Palestinians, by the way, who say, look, let the Israelis stay where they are. Let's just have one state. They say it because they have, they say, look, Israel works. What do we have? Last year I was sitting with some younger Palestinians and I said, what do you want? And one of them said, honestly, I said, well, look, I'm not asking the questions for you to give me a dishonest answer. I said, what do you want? And she says to me, the leader of this group says to me, honestly, I want a job. I want to be able to go to the beach and drink beer. And she was basically saying, you think I can get that on our side? There's a disaffection there, and it threatens the nature of the Palestinian national movement. There is a need on their side to get their house in order and explain what is it that they want. I mean, that can only be done by Palestinians. It can't be done from the outside. Look, on the issue of what can be done in Syria. Syria today continues not to control all of its own territory. We have in the northeast, we have an enclave where we have very extreme Islamist groups, backed mostly by Turkey. We have the Syrian Democratic Forces, they're in the northwest, and the Syrian Democratic Forces are more in the northeast. They are, among others, backed by us, not liked by Syria, not backed by Turkey. They control their area. The Syrian government doesn't. In the south, there is a growing Iranian presence, which one of the reasons the Israelis act as much as they do there is because of the Iranian presence. This is a country where the writ of the regime doesn't extend throughout all of the country. It is a country where half the population has been displaced, either because they've left the country or because they're internally displaced. It is a country where you have a generation of kids who don't go to school and are probably suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. It is a country where at least $300 billion is needed for reconstruction. To think that there is any early answer to Syria is an illusion. You know, so long as Assad is there, there'll never be reconciliation, but nobody can force him out because of Russian and Iranian protection. So, you know, I don't think there are any good answers to Syria for some time to come until this regime is out. You know, everybody wants to have an answer where you flip a light switch and everything's better. You know, this is one where unfortunately I don't have some positive answers. Usually I'll say, all right, here's what can be done. I think you just try to do the best you can to support people from a humanitarian standpoint until the Assad regime is no more. There is no possibility of fixing Syria so long as he's there. There's no possibility of getting refugees to return. By the way, who would like to return to Syria? They will not return to Syria because they don't trust what will be done to them if they do. And there's enough of a track record for those who have to know that, you know, the risk to them is extremely high if they come back. So I hate to end on a downer, but Syria is a downer.
Ambassador Ross, thank you very much. Thank you for this insightful conversation. We learned a lot, and thank you to our audience, remote audience and audience in person, for being with us tonight. I also want to invite you to our 2 remaining talks of the semester. On October 24th, on Monday, we will host Dr. John Izzo, who will give a talk on leadership in a crisis-filled world. Dr. Izzo is a best-selling author and one of the most sought-after voices on leadership. He was a friend and mentor of John Edwin Mroz. Thank you for joining us, and good night. Thank you very much.